At the very beginning of our relationship, my wife and I made a firm decision not to have children. This choice was not influenced by our marital status, as we both agreed with this even before the engagement. Our position on this issue remained unshakable even after the wedding. We found satisfaction in our lives without having to raise children, which allowed us to prioritize our careers and develop our relationship. In fact, my wife was categorically against starting a family. My wife, Jenny, was absolutely against having children even more than I was. I was convinced that if she had accidentally become pregnant during our relationship, I would have supported her and assumed the responsibility of fatherhood. However, Jenny remained firm in her desire to remain childless. Her determination was obvious, and I respected her decision. It is worth noting that Jenny considers herself a religious person. Now, looking back on our past, I understand that Jenny's rejection of having children could have been caused by fear rather than deep-rooted beliefs. However, at the time, I respected her point of view and didn't want to undermine her views. Therefore, I agreed with her concerns about our intimate relationship, despite the fact that she categorically objected to the use of any means of contraception. It is worth noting that we both knew that we had no problems with conception, so personally, it did not bother me. This conversation arose at the very beginning of our relationship, even before the beginning of an intimate relationship. I once suggested that she see a doctor to consider using birth control pills, but my suggestion caused her strong anger and disagreement. It turned out that she was categorically against the use of any means of protection, despite her fears about accidental pregnancy. This contradiction puzzled me because she stubbornly refused to compromise with her beliefs and at the same time expressed concern about the possible consequences. For Jenny, the thought of having a child was her worst nightmare. Looking back, I now realize that I was so deeply attracted to her that I could not realize the absurdity of our situation. As a result, we never entered into a traditional intimate relationship. I understand that for many people, this arrangement may seem incredibly unusual, but I was ready to give her a chance because my love for Jenny blinded me, and I didn't see any other possibilities. By Jenny's presence, I was deeply fascinated, almost addicted, to the special love we shared. It was an intoxicating sensation similar to a powerful drug. My wife had an amazing ability to satisfy my desires, and throughout our relationship, our intimate encounters focused exclusively on engaging in unconventional intimacy. Surprisingly, I found great satisfaction in this limited range of experiences because my wife was able to bring me to the point of bliss with this kind of pleasure. Although our physical experiments and understanding of our bodies were limited, it did not diminish the intensity and pleasure I experienced. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride knowing that some men might envy the intimate relationship I had with my wife. I thought I was incredibly lucky to have such a deep connection with her, which allowed me to enjoy only through her. It was just incredible how lucky I was to have such intimacy with my partner. I considered myself a devoted and satisfied husband because my wife always seemed content with our life together and the satisfaction of our closeness. Looking back now, I realized that I may have exceeded her expectations in this regard and that my prowess in bed may have been more than she desired. I know that many men would like to experience the pleasure and freedom that I experienced in a relationship with Jenny. Unfortunately, not all partners are ready for such an experience. I understand that some men may be envious of my position and dream of such a thing, but looking at the situation from the other side, I doubt that many men are really ready to accept the unconventional form of relationship that Jenny and I had. I understand that it may seem too good to be true and that I may seem too good to be real. It may seem unconventional, but I willingly sacrificed the traditional pleasure of intimate meetings for my wife's happiness, and to tell the truth, we were both genuinely pleased with our arrangement. Another aspect that brought great joy to our lives was the harmonious relations between our families. When I first met Jenny's parents, who were invited to dinner in the early stages of our relationship, I instantly won their hearts. Even before the wedding, her father already had a favorable impression of me from the moment I mentioned that I am an engineer and studied at the University of California. Jenny's mother immediately liked me. She was especially pleased that I respected and accepted her daughter's strong religious beliefs. She played an important role in introducing Jenny to a life based on the 10 Commandments and other religious principles. I must admit that I am not particularly devout myself, but my wife, being firm in her faith, always prayed for both of us. Jenny's mother was a kind woman in her 50s, and her acceptance and support meant a lot to our relationship. Despite her age, she retained an attractive appearance, and it was obvious that she paid great attention to self-care. Not only was she always ready to help my wife and me with household chores, but sometimes she was a little too intrusive. She showed excessive interest in our personal life, sometimes crossing the boundaries of what was allowed. For example, during dinners when Jenny went to the kitchen for a while, leaving us alone, she took the opportunity to engage in inappropriate conversations. She asked about the methods of contraception that my wife and I use, insistently demanding answers. But each time, I managed to deftly evade her questions, skillfully avoiding a direct answer. However, after a while, she made a bold decision to ask about our methods of contraception directly from both of us. She asked curiously about the effectiveness of the calendar method that my wife uses as a means of contraception. Although I was ready to brush off her annoying questions once again, I was stunned when my wife answered without hesitation. "Don't worry, Mom," she replied confidently, "you don't have to worry about my pregnancy." I must mention one curious point related to my mother-in-law, which still confuses me. Despite her religious beliefs and having her own daughter, she was extremely reluctant to become a grandmother. Looking back, it becomes obvious that Jenny's decision to refuse to have children was made under the strong influence of her mother. Even now, I can't understand what caused her deviation from the typical desires of older women who are looking forward to becoming grandmothers. A puzzled expression appeared on her face as she expressed her embarrassment. "What? Are you and your husband not getting intimate, my dear? This is not ideal. Your priority should be to enjoy your spouse," my wife quickly explained. "Oh, Mom, we have a full-fledged intimate relationship, just not in the traditional manner. We have found alternative ways to physically express our love." Surprisingly, the mother-in-law seemed to immediately understand what was going on. An unusual smile appeared on her face, as if she was proud that we had found a unique solution in our marriage. She nodded with genuine delight, radiating a sense of joy. Surprisingly, after this rather unpleasant conversation, my relationship with my wife's mother began to flourish even more. The positive thing was that her importunity seemed to have decreased. She gave us more leeway as her anxiety decreased. It became obvious that I was really the right partner for her daughter, ready to sacrifice my personal preferences for the sake of respecting her views. That's how it all started. We indulged in intimacy almost every day, often several times a day. On our free days, we were so consumed with passion that it seemed impossible to leave the bed. However, when this regularity abruptly stopped, we both felt an emptiness in our lives. Or maybe only I felt it. I sincerely believe that at that time, we both felt a sense of longing. This coincided with a significant project that required my full attention. At first, I explained our temporary pause in intimate life by the workload. In this regard, I began to come home later than usual, striving to ensure that everything was carefully prepared and organized. As an engineer, I had a lot of responsibility on my shoulders. After spending countless hours managing the project and forcing myself to perform tasks as efficiently as possible, I returned home completely exhausted, unable to engage in even the simplest conversation. It would be easy for an outsider to think that it was me who was unfaithful, constantly coming home late from work and too tired to satisfy my wife's needs. Paradoxically, I actually felt remorse about the situation. I couldn't help feeling guilty that I couldn't give her as much pleasure as I once did. But at some point, the colossal project came to an end, or maybe it was a transition to a more responsible and time-consuming activity. Unexpectedly for me, it was my wife who became overloaded with work and was constantly fatigued. Jenny held a technical position at the TV channel, so I was genuinely surprised by her sudden need to linger after a normal working day. Understand, I'm not trying to belittle the significance of her work in any way. This was a rare case since she had never had to work at such a late hour before. When I tried to find out about the reasons for the prolonged working day, she simply replied that these were current technical problems that required the attention of the entire team. From the very beginning, deep down, I knew that this explanation was far from the truth. But what I didn't know was that the reality turned out to be much more disturbing than I could have imagined. In my confusion, I even thought that her actions were revenge, a way to get back at me for leaving her alone even on weekends. Arriving home late and tired from work, I realized that I could not take offense at her behavior. It's understandable that she might feel annoyed because lately, I haven't been able to devote enough time to her. To some extent, it showed how much she appreciated the minutes we spent together. At least that's what I thought at the time. I also thought that her discontent would subside as soon as she noticed my attempts to improve our relationship. I thought that eventually, she would stop spending time with her girlfriends after work. I thought that was exactly what she did every time she told me she was late at work. And repeatedly, I convinced myself that she was deliberately doing this to get back at me. I expected her to pretend to be tired all the time, but to my surprise, she didn't. In the end, she stopped even trying to give the impression that this was happening solely because of her work. I clearly remember the evening when her deception could no longer be hidden. We were both coming home from work. It was already quite late. That day, I had to work late to have time to prepare everything necessary for the upcoming project. Oddly enough, I didn't feel tired, or rather, I was tired, but not so tired that I couldn't let my wife fall asleep peacefully. Just the smell of her when I lay down next to her instantly woke me up. I remembered hugging her delicate, fragile-looking body with my own, realizing how small she seemed in comparison. I showered gentle kisses on the skin behind her ear and continued to trace them along her neck, hugging her to me. I tried to slip my hand under the loose blouse in which she usually went to bed, hoping to make this night unforgettable. But my attempts to create something special were quickly stopped. My wife seemed to have anticipated my intentions from the very beginning. With unshakable confidence, she grabbed my hand and firmly pushed it away from her body, which surprised me a lot. I even raised myself slightly on my elbow in search of an answer. I shifted my gaze to her as she turned away from me. She remained motionless. "My dear," I whispered softly in her ear, not wanting to give up yet. I wanted to create an atmosphere filled with passion and desire. "I'm tired, Chuck," she replied, as if my attempts to captivate her, which reminded me of our old days, did not matter at all. I sat up straight on the bed and looked over Jenny's shoulder, hoping to see her face, but she quickly closed her eyes when I did this. She seemed to avoid talking and eye contact, as if she didn't want me to communicate with her. It was weird. Earlier, when we were both at work, I talked to Jenny on the phone. She noted that her working day was relatively calm and even boring at times. She admitted that she would like me to be with her so that she would be more interesting and busy. I sincerely believed that the crisis in our intimate life had miraculously disappeared. So why was she suddenly tired? I wondered, thinking about the reasons for her fatigue. I persistently tried to initiate intimacy with her. I couldn't deny it, I was consumed by desire. I hoped that after our conversation on the phone during working hours, she would let go of her obvious anger at me for being late at work earlier. I longed for the passionate lovemaking she once offered me. "I want you," I said, feeling a heavy sigh escape Jenny's lips. She clutched the pillow a little tighter, showing a hint of concern. "Chuck," she replied softly, her voice trembling slightly, "believe me, I really want intimacy with you at this moment. I've always wanted this." Her words only increased my confusion. Frowning, I approached her once again, wanting to clarify the situation. This time she didn't move away from me, but she didn't get closer either. She just stayed in the same position she was lying in. I asked her what was bothering her. My head was still in turmoil. I was trying to understand the meaning of her words. What did she mean by that? Why does she sound like she's feeling guilty? My thoughts seemed sluggish, which made it difficult to understand, but I had an uneasy feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to this situation than it seemed at first glance. "We can't have an intimate relationship, Chuck," she said, leaving me in complete shock. My mind raced, trying to figure out what she meant. What is it? Is this another strange aspect related to the religious beliefs that she so stubbornly adhered to? I've already made sacrifices just for her. Frankly, I wasn't sure I could tolerate such circumstances. Trying to get clarification, I asked the question. Although, due to the emotional state of confusion and anxiety, I hardly remember what exactly was said. But one phrase uttered by her was vividly imprinted in my memory, instantly causing disturbing sensations. She told me that she has herpes, in particular, intimate herpes. I know it may seem silly, but for me, it was like my whole world had suddenly collapsed. Our already limited and somewhat pinched lifestyle, dictated by the rules imposed on Jenny by her well-meaning but controlling mother, seemed to have received another crushing blow. I couldn't understand how such a misfortune had entered our lives. What did I do to deserve such a cruel twist of fate? Even now, when I express these thoughts, they seem absurd to me, but at that moment, my thoughts were preoccupied with these questions. I plucked up the courage and began to ask for details. How did she know? Was she sure? How did this situation develop? But it seemed she was too shy to answer. I watched her agitated behavior, flushed cheeks, and trembling hands. The palpable sweat under the sheet testified to her deep discomfort. She reluctantly refused to talk further about the situation that had suddenly arisen in front of us. In the end, we lay down for the night, and silence enveloped our shared uncertainty. Unlike her ability to fall asleep effortlessly, I found myself unable to close my eyes throughout the night. When we both got up the next day, I was overcome with fatigue. Perhaps under the influence of fatigue, a feeling of irritation increased in me, prompting me to explore all the depths of this unforeseen circumstance that had penetrated into our marriage. I was surprised at how little I knew about herpes. Although I knew that herpes can be transmitted through kissing, I realized the need for further self-education. Up to this point, my knowledge was limited to the fact that I was lucky enough never to encounter this disease personally. Moreover, I assumed that the dynamics of the development of anal herpes would be different from other forms. It took a lot of effort to convince my wife to talk about her illness, but in the end, she agreed. To my surprise, I found that she did not seek medical confirmation, and her belief in the presence of herpes was based solely on assumptions. She seemed to have a feeling of having symptoms without any specific diagnosis. In response to her guesses, I grinned and assured her that I would accompany her to the doctor's office to remove all possible concerns. To my surprise, she strongly opposed this idea. This immediately caused me alarm. Why does she express uncertainty about her condition and at the same time stubbornly refuse to seek professional medical help, which could give her confidence that she is completely healthy? I was puzzled. Why does she prefer to stay at home burdened with worries, and at the same time, my own anxiety for her well-being increases? A heated argument ensued between us, which turned into a loud, intense quarrel. In the heat of the quarrel, I even hinted that her unwillingness to see a doctor and the mention of herpes was just a thoughtful and peculiar excuse to avoid intimacy with me. But she refuted my accusations with complete confidence, and I felt stupid and insecure. I was consumed by bewilderment. The situation began to seem meaningless and incomprehensible. Despite the fact that she insisted on a sincere desire to enjoy communicating with me, she could not explain any significant reasons for her refusal to see a doctor. Her only excuse was the fear of experiencing awkwardness again. But I couldn't help but laugh at her explanation. I was well acquainted with her upbringing in a religious family and understood how deeply rooted these values were in her. Contrary to her usual behavior, my wife, as a rule, did not feel embarrassed in front of doctors. After numerous attempts, I still managed to convince her to make an appointment in the near future. To our credit, we didn't waste any time. That afternoon, we got into my car and I drove Jenny to the nearest clinic. Throughout the trip, her body remained stiff and tense. Attempts to start a conversation were useless, as her nervousness was palpable. Instead, she stared out the window of the car, not taking her eyes off the passing road. Her attentive gaze only increased my anxiety for her health. At that moment, as I am thinking now, my life took a completely different shape than before. I feel a sense of annoyance at myself for having spent so much time and effort worrying about a situation that turned out to be useless in the end. However, this is a story for another time. Now, I'm not going to delve into the current state of my life. Let me tell you about how my experience with my beloved Jenny developed. Our path leads to the clinic where a doctor was waiting for us, whom Jenny trusted, a specialist with whom I also managed to get acquainted from time to time. Jenny asked me to attend routine checkups, and fortunately, I was usually allowed to accompany her to the doctor's office. Miss Smith, Jenny's doctor, has always been sympathetic to both of us, but this visit was not like all the previous ones. My wife strongly expressed her desire that I should not accompany her to the office, and her refusal left no room for negotiations. When I approached the office, Miss Smith was looking at me in bewilderment, and my wife confidently walked past her and entered the office. When the door closed behind them, I found myself alone in the clinic's waiting room, caught up in a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty. The whole situation threw me into complete bewilderment. I fell into a state of temporary insanity, reflecting on the significance of my wife's refusal to discuss this issue with me and her adamant decision to undergo a medical examination alone. Suspicion crept into my thoughts, but I felt powerless to do anything. It remained only to wait patiently, hoping that some clarity would come with time. Sitting in the waiting room, I felt anxiety running through my body, causing my legs and arms to tremble uncontrollably. It seemed that time dragged on endlessly until the silence was broken by the sound of the door opening. Miss Smith, the doctor, appeared, staring at me intently. At that moment, I felt a great sense of anxiety, a deep premonition that something had happened. My expectation of my wife's appearance from the office was replaced by disappointment since she did not follow the doctor. With a barely perceptible nod in my direction, the doctor seemed to invite me back to the office, hinting at the need for a conversation that could unravel the disturbing mystery that had opened. Rising from my seat, I frowned. Miss Smith opened the door with a solemn gesture, slightly bowing her head. My palms became damp with sweat as I walked past her and sank into a cold, sterile medical chair, overcome with anxiety. Following this, Dr. Smith entered the room. The burden of my worries was getting heavier, a stream of thoughts rushed through my head. What could be wrong with my beloved wife, Jenny? At the thought of herpes, a wave of anxiety swept over me, and a shiver ran down my spine. Jenny was sitting next to me, a worried expression on her face, her hands shaking with excitement. We had faced difficulties together more than once, but this time, the atmosphere was special. There was concern in her gaze, mirroring my own concerns, but there was something else lurking beneath the surface of her brown eyes, an unfamiliar guilt-inducing flicker. Although I immediately thought about it, I couldn't be sure at that moment. The time was not right. Mrs. Smith settled into the chair opposite us, her gaze firm and confident. I swallowed hard, trying to collect my thoughts and formulate my concerns. The sterile environment increased my anxiety, and there was an oppressive silence in the room. Taking a deep breath, I plucked up the courage and turned to Dr. Smith, my voice trembling with fear. "Dr. Smith, is this true?" I managed to say, even though my voice was shaking. A lump formed in my throat, and it was difficult to find words to express the situation. It seemed that my mind and body were in opposition, unwilling to accept the reality unfolding in front of me. The idea that my wife could be sick with something so absurd at first glance was difficult to comprehend. Despite my attempts to formulate my thoughts, Dr. Smith listened attentively to me, her eyes full of sympathy with solemn understanding. She nodded her approval, repeating the gesture she had made earlier when she silently asked me to enter the office. Jenny apparently told Dr. Smith about our shared suspicions. It became obvious that the doctor was aware of my partial understanding of the situation. A deep breath, a serious expression on Miss Smith's face intensified the pounding of my heart. Holding my breath, I anxiously waited for her words. Countless scenarios raced through my head, but the gnawing uncertainty did not leave. Hope flashed through me. I desperately wished that all these oddities and the behavior of my wife and her doctor were just a deliberate hoax. I silently prayed that it would be so. Finally, Dr. Smith broke the silence. Her voice was soft but determined. "Chuck, I understand your concern for Jenny. After conducting an examination and additional tests, I regret to inform you that judging by the results, Jenny has her own problems." Her words froze in the air, their weight gradually decreased as I comprehended the seriousness of the information received. It seemed that time had frozen in place. It seemed that the walls of the room were closing in, suffocating me, and I was trying to come to terms with the harsh reality. A whirlwind of questions clouded my thoughts, but before I could utter a single question that consumed my mind, Mrs. Smith broke the silence again. "Mr. Grant, we will also require you to take a series of tests," she said. I could feel the tension building up in my wife's body next to me. In my peripheral vision, I caught my wife shaking her head in disagreement with Dr. Smith, accompanied by a nervous look. Then Jenny tilted her head and made an unusual sound, like a sob and a howl. I noticed that Dr. Smith looked at her with regret, as if she regretted her words. It was all like surrealism, and I was at a loss. "Why is that?" I asked, unable to comprehend the situation. Miss Smith met my gaze, a serious expression on her face. There was concern behind the glasses. Given your marital status, we cannot rule out the possibility that you have genital herpes, since this type of infection is usually transmitted through sexual contact, Dr. Smith said, nodding her head slightly. In order to verify the accuracy of our data and prescribe the right treatment for you, we need to conduct additional examinations, Mr. Grant. Time seemed to have stopped. Every syllable echoed in my ears with an inexplicable heaviness. A feeling of horror gripped my mind, plunging it into the abyss, and an icy chill crept up my spine. Miss Smith's words dragged on, leaving me at a loss. How is this possible for me? I remembered all the precautions and sacrifices I had made in the past just for the sake of my wife, Jenny. This unexpected turn of events seemed rude and uninvited, intruding into my life without permission. How could it be that I didn't notice this before? How did I not notice any changes in my body, in my general well-being, and how did my wife so quickly, seemingly out of the blue, feel that something was wrong? I couldn't understand it. The frustration inside me grew, forcing me to clench my fists, clinging tightly to the seat. What the hell is going on here? Like a tsunami, a flood of emotions hit me. Shock, amazement, and an uneasy sense of betrayal gripped me. I struggled to find the words to express the turbulent flow of emotions bubbling inside. In an instant, the world I had imagined collapsed before my eyes, leaving me bewildered and disoriented. My life with Jenny had always been unconventional, but now it seemed even more unusual, as if the ground had shifted under my feet. Upon closer inspection, the reality of the situation struck me. It was hard to imagine that now, for no reason at all, I could also be infected. What's happening? I left the doctor's office as if I had entered another dimension, clutching in my hands the referral for an additional examination that Dr. Smith had told me about. I wasted no time making an appointment at the same clinic. Jenny did the same for her medical examination, quickly taking action in connection with such an unexpected turn of events. We left the building, got into the car, and started our way home, but every moment I couldn't get rid of the feeling of detachment from the present moment. Despite the fact that I was driving, my body felt numb, detached from reality. The weight of what had happened overwhelmed me, and I could not imagine the upcoming conversation with Jenny. When we arrived home, there was an eerie silence between us, and we refrained from any words. I couldn't muster the strength to start a conversation, and it seemed that Jenny didn't want to bring up the topic of our visit to Dr. Smith's office either. The gravity of the situation hung in the air, creating an unspoken barrier between us. The words remained locked inside, but the silence continued, and we were both at a loss, not knowing how to get out of this delicate and difficult situation. A feeling of helplessness gripped us, as if we were both at a loss and could not find words to express a lot of emotions and thoughts related to recent events. Neither of us could find the courage to touch on this awkward topic that hung over us. Therefore, all the following days, we preferred to remain silent. It's not that we didn't talk at all, we just avoided delving into this topic. We continued to have everyday conversations, maintaining the appearance of a normal life while waiting for the upcoming results of the examinations. If we hadn't received any disturbing news in the doctor's office, everything would probably have been the same as before. But there was a significant shift, the consequences of which Jenny and I felt for ourselves. Our closeness disappeared. Despite the fact that we slept in the same bed, it seemed to us that we were sleeping separately. Gone was the physical affection that we once shared, sweet kisses and pecks on the cheeks, the passionate kisses we exchanged when one of us came home from work disappeared. Even thoughts of intimacy seemed far away against the background of the current situation. This continued for several days leading up to our subsequent visit to the clinic. The purpose of our visit was to clarify the situation with herpes. I was examined by my regular doctor and then passed additional tests under the supervision of a specialist. My wife and I anxiously waited for the results from the laboratory, realizing that they would lead to significant changes in our lives, especially in marriage. At that moment, I still did not fully realize what consequences this would lead to. But when the results of the medical examination were confirmed, the truth became indisputable. Jenny was indeed diagnosed with genital herpes. The reality of the situation hit me hard, and I couldn't fool myself anymore. It was clear that we had a difficult path ahead of us, but I did not lose hope that we would be able to overcome it. It became obvious that everything was not as I had hoped. There were only a few minutes left before I had to face the harsh reality. Soon, the results of my laboratory tests came, but not in the usual way. Miss Smith appeared and motioned for me to come into the office. Her expression was serious, but with a hint of special sympathy. My wife and I exchanged glances, and Dr. Smith directed my wife to her office with a slight movement. She asked my wife to stay in the waiting room and stressed that she needed to talk to me alone. Fear flashed in my wife's eyes, and I frowned in confusion with a sense of awkwardness. I followed Dr. Smith into her office, feeling the strangeness of being alone with her in this environment. After all, she had always been my wife's doctor, and this situation was unusual. Taking her place at the table, she motioned for me to sit across from her. I obediently took my seat, not knowing what to expect in this unexpected conversation. A deep sigh escaped her lips, and she took off her glasses, lightly massaging her forehead before meeting my gaze. There was an unfamiliar intensity in her eyes that took me by surprise. I clearly remember this moment, although it was difficult for me to understand its true meaning. I couldn't understand why she needed to talk to me alone, away from my wife, who otherwise might have heard everything she wanted to say. Fear gripped me tightly, twisting around my thoughts. Disturbing scenarios swarmed in my head, the most striking of which was that my wife's condition had taken a critical turn. I was prepared for the fact that I might hear terrible news, for example, that the time of our life together is limited, that I should give preference to her happiness before it was too late. The conclusions were hasty, perhaps premature, but my concern was sincere. Uncertainty hung over me, and I didn't know what to expect from this important conversation. The seriousness of the situation gave me no peace. Can herpes really lead to such terrible consequences? Is there really no hope, no cure, or is there something else, another hidden disease that I don't suspect? Just the thought that my wife was suffering from additional diseases caused a shiver down my spine. It can't be true. Dr. Smith pulled herself together, exhaled, and addressed me with unexpected calmness. There was no trace of nervousness in her voice reflected on her face. Mr. Grant, she began, according to the results of the examination, your wife has some complications, but there's no need to worry. Miss Grant will receive appropriate treatment as soon as possible. Dr. Smith assured me, her attempt to smile failed. I exhaled, trying to calm down before gathering the courage to ask the question that was bothering me. I was afraid of the answer, but it was necessary to know it. Uncertainty hung over me, and I did not know what to expect and how to prepare for the upcoming revelation. And what about me? I finally said, and the words came to me with great difficulty. I couldn't explain why it was so hard for me to say it out loud. It was incredibly uncomfortable and embarrassing to express my concerns to my wife's doctor. Embarrassment overwhelmed me, and it became difficult for me to pronounce such words in such an environment. Dr. Smith paused for a moment, sighing heavily before answering, no. She sounded so confident in her words that all remaining doubts instantly disappeared. My health was impeccable. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Dr. Smith abruptly intervened in the conversation, and I impatiently waited for her further words. Feeling puzzled when Dr. Smith started talking, memories of our previous meeting came flooding back. She repeated what she had explained earlier, the transmission of genital herpes usually occurs during sexual contact. My brain was racing, connecting the dots. If I was not infected with genital herpes, then this explains why my wife got infected with this virus. Suddenly, I realized that I didn't need to listen any further. I understood perfectly well what she was driving at. I wasn't naive or feeble-minded. The intensity of her gaze only confirmed what I already knew in my heart. To my bewilderment, I remained uninfected, while my wife became infected. Genital herpes is transmitted mainly through sexual contact, and it was clear that she had somehow become infected. The most logical and obvious explanation at that time was that she had to have sexual intercourse with someone other than me. It was a shocking discovery, and I couldn't understand how I hadn't noticed it until now. The weight of the truth fell on me like a ton of bricks, leaving me speechless and stunned. No going through this terrible news. I did not allow myself to think about my wife in such a negative light. Despite the unpleasant news, I still had a glimmer of hope. At least I didn't get genital herpes. I reassured myself, trying to keep a positive attitude. Those were the last words I remembered in Dr. Smith's office. With a heavy heart, I got up from my seat and quickly left. It became obvious that my wife had consulted Dr. Smith long before I found out about the infection. My thoughts were busy with my wife, full of questions and mixed emotions. I wondered if Jenny had asked Dr. Smith to keep the origin of her illness a secret, as she had done with me. Reflecting on the situation, I became more and more convinced of this possibility. As soon as I left the office and took a quick glance at my wife, I noticed tears welling up in her eyes. It was as if she felt the emotions bubbling in me, catching my understanding look. Perhaps she took it as confirmation that I had found out her secret. Despite the fact that I still had hoped that all this was a huge misunderstanding, the gravity of the situation weighed on me. At that moment, it became absolutely clear to me that my wife had contracted herpes sexually. She unwittingly presented me with the answer on a silver platter, leaving no room for doubt. The truth was revealed to me, and it became painfully obvious that my wife had cheated on me. The weight of betrayal weighed on my heart. When I confronted her, her tearful pleas for forgiveness went unheeded. When we left the clinic, I was overwhelmed by a wave of disgust. The thought of her sitting in my car and accompanying me home suddenly filled me with contempt. At that moment, I wanted to rid myself of her presence, to break the ties that bind us. With such a combination of circumstances, there was a desire to erase her from my life right here and now. But I made a conscious decision to keep my head up. I was silent, not saying a word and not giving in to the impulse to throw out offensive insults. Despite the emotions raging inside me, I managed to maintain a semblance of calm, although inside, I felt like a hurricane ready to unleash its destructive power. I couldn't understand how I managed to stay calm when Jenny's tears didn't stop throughout the entire trip home. When we got home, I found the strength to ask her to pack her things and leave as soon as possible. Her screams and cries echoed loudly on the walls. Her desperate pleas for love and the desire to save our relationship did not find a response. She admitted that her carelessness was an unfortunate mistake, a momentary omission. But her words could not break through the stupor that gripped me. Disappointment gripped me when I realized that I had done something stupid. My love for Jenny was undeniable, and I put a lot of effort into adapting to her beliefs and boundaries. I voluntarily abandoned the idea of ordinary intimacy because we both agreed not to have children, and she considered contraception morally unacceptable. I sacrificed my own pleasure to live up to her ideals, and I consistently supported her in all aspects of our life together. Despite my deep love for her, it was painful for me to realize that my efforts were not enough to satisfy Jenny. I sincerely fulfilled all her wishes, and she decided to betray me, tarnishing herself at the same time. It was the last blow, the turning point when it became clear that she did not intend to leave. I took matters into my own hands and began to pack her things. It was a firm decision that she could no longer challenge or change. Gradually, she seemed to realize the futility of resisting the consequences of my choice. In the end, she gave up, no longer trying to stop the tears flowing down her face. After packing up her things, she eventually left. She got into the car and drove away, leaving me wondering if the weight of it all had overloaded me. In the days that followed, I was overcome by a stupor that became a defense against shocking and heartbreaking events. Despite the inner devastation, I was unable to express or even realize its magnitude. It is possible that disbelief held me captive, unwilling to loosen its grip. At the moment when I try to think about my past as little as possible, one thing remains very clear: I managed to overcome all these emotional wounds inflicted by difficult circumstances, including the presence of genital herpes and my wife's unexpected betrayal. Gradually, I tightened despite the silence that followed her departure, which left me unaware of her whereabouts. I made a conscious effort to move forward and rebuild my life. I took action after learning the truth about my wife's struggle with herpes. I threw myself into work, sought solace in the company of friends, and in the evenings, tried to retire. Slowly but surely, I felt that I was recovering. I diligently pushed away thoughts of my future ex-wife, and for a while, it seemed that it helped. But one fateful day, the doorbell rang, and I opened it without hesitation to meet the unexpected presence of my wife's mother. As soon as I saw her, my first impulse was to slam the door, pretending that I didn't know how to open it. But such a reaction would be unwise, especially since she was standing in front of me with an unusual smile, devoid of any signs of anger or revenge for what I allegedly did to her daughter. It might have been a deliberate ploy to catch me off guard, but I couldn't be sure of her intentions. Uncertainty hung over me, and I didn't know what to do in my current state of mind, which was far from optimal, given recent events. I agreed without hesitation when she asked if she could come in, not knowing what was waiting for me. I had no idea that this meeting would be a turning point not only in my relationship with my wife, but also in our relationship with her mother. I always knew that the mother of my future ex-wife had a peculiar character, which only increased the uncertainty of upcoming events. I couldn't get rid of the memories of our previous meeting when my mother-in-law curiously asked about contraception, which my wife and I use. The confidence with which my wife replied, as well as the enthusiastic reaction of her mother, left me perplexed. It was, to put it mildly, a strange and disturbing day. But I reasoned with myself, thinking about the worst-case scenario that could develop. After all that my wife had been through, considering my actions towards her, the worst-case scenario that loomed over me was the possibility that she would try to harm me. But in my numb state of consciousness, I didn't care. I just didn't care. On the other hand, in a better scenario, she might have wanted to discuss the inevitable divorce that awaited us. However, there was also an alarming possibility that it could be about something completely different. The uncertainty weighed on me, and I felt depressed. I was in a state of uncertainty, not knowing what to expect, and was preparing for any outcome, mentally preparing for various situations. I was not ready for what could happen between us. At the same time, without saying a word, the mother-in-law confidently walked into the kitchen, immediately feeling at home. She calmly sat down on a chair, took off her coat, and threw it over the back. A sigh escaped her lips, and she fixed her gaze on me, keeping a faint smile on her face. But when she looked at me, there was a barely noticeable shift in her eyes, which increased the severity of the moment. The apology seemed to come from her, carrying a sense of regret. I could not understand why she could ask for forgiveness because it was her daughter's actions that led to the fact that our marriage broke up in such a disastrous way. "I'm sorry," she cut in sharply before I could say a word. Confused, I asked about the meaning of her words but got a grin in response. "You've been so kind to my daughter, even too much," she added, leaving me perplexed and searching for answers. There was an expression of disbelief in her daughter's actions in her eyes. "I didn't even imagine that my sweet girl could do this," she muttered, shaking her head. A heavy sigh escaped my lips, and I braced myself for a conversation that I assumed was supposed to be about convincing me to make peace with Jenny. But before I could express my thoughts, she quickly interrupted me. No, Chuck, that's not what I meant," she explained, and her tone became urgent. "I want the exact opposite from you. I don't want you to ever think about my daughter again." Every second, I was overcome with embarrassment and was completely at a loss. While I was sitting, the woman got up from her chair, fixing me with a steady gaze. With confident steps, she approached me, ignoring my immobility. Perhaps emboldened by the lack of reaction, she came closer, slightly tilting her head up to meet my gaze. Her words hung in the air, ominous and full of determination. "My daughter will face the consequences of her actions." Her words froze in the air, uttered in a low tone in which there was a hint of weakness. It seemed like she was whispering secrets meant only for my ears. She sounded grateful that I was present in her daughter's life. Before I could answer, she gently silenced me by putting her finger to her lips, calling me to silence. Realizing the severity of my recent neglect, she tried to make amends by offering comfort in her words. Smiling, she turned to me. "I will let you enjoy communicating with me, my dear Chucky." There was a seriousness in her tone that left no room for humor. "I want you to treat me the same way as my daughter, fully aware of her past actions. Drop all inhibitions before rushing to condemn or resort to insults. I ask you to empathize and think about my point of view. Try to imagine yourself in my place, a person who enjoyed a full-fledged intimate relationship with his spouse. Let's be frank and open about this issue." I was already used to the pleasant release I was experiencing. It was something indescribable for me. But what happened was far from my expectations. I was completely unprepared, neither psychologically nor physically. The memories of our meeting in the kitchen in a standing position are still vivid in my memory. I couldn't wait to invite her into the bedroom after a long absence of intimate moments. I was finally ready. It doesn't matter with whom, even if it was my wife's mother. Because we were still in the process of divorce, in the absence of emotional ties, any middle-aged woman could be with her mother. I didn't dwell on it too much. It's worth noting that her conversational skills were impressive. She invited me to vent my emotions, and I agreed. All the pent-up anger in me spilled out. The pleasure my wife gave me was pleasant, but this meeting was on a whole new level. It was obvious that her mother had a wealth of experience. She understood my desires perfectly and skillfully turned me on with words. Throughout the meeting, her mother exceeded all expectations. I know it may seem unconventional, but I have to admit the truth. After such strong pleasure, I was panting and sweating as if I had just run a marathon. I was on the verge of losing consciousness. My wife's mother, on the contrary, looked completely calm, as if she was used to such physical exertion. In a soft, gentle voice, she confessed that she had been looking forward to our meeting for a long time. She praised my abilities and expressed sympathy for her daughter, who lost the opportunity to be with me. Exhausted and unable to say a word, I just smiled back. After our meeting, Jenny came to my house, which was once her home. The next day, as she was getting out of the car, I saw through the kitchen window how she was pouring tears of suffering. She burst into my house, pounding on the door with force, shouting accusations against her mother and me. She claimed to know all the details of what was going on between us and lamented how much she was hurt because of our unhappy marriage. Despite her outburst, I decided not to open the door. I was still tormented by anger at her. I could not look into her eyes without feeling an irresistible desire to pounce on her. I may still have been overshadowed by recent events, but I didn't make excuses for my actions. Jenny betrayed my trust by committing treason. After I informed her that our marriage was over and asked her to leave home, I became intimate with her mother. Although I didn't consider it treason on my part, she violated our obligations. Her actions proved that she didn't deserve me and didn't deserve my forgiveness. It was extremely important that she faced the consequences of her choice without my presence. A few weeks later, I saw her at the lawyer's office, where we met to finalize and sign the divorce papers. Despite the anger and disgust in her eyes, I remained indifferent to Jenny's emotions. I signed all the necessary documents and continued to live on. Before the start of the divorce proceedings, Jenny repeatedly tried to contact me, but I preferred not to answer her calls. My attention was focused solely on preparing for the upcoming trial. I was determined to win this case because it was obvious that our marriage had broken up because of her actions. The fault lay with her, and I was determined to make sure that the judge also saw it. Based on this, I turned to Dr. Smith for help. I quietly met with her and received the necessary documents. Surprisingly, my wife's doctor played a significant role in helping me throughout the process, and a close bond was established between us. She was looking forward to my divorce proceedings, which seemed a little strange to me. Nevertheless, I assured her that I would keep her informed of all developments. Thanks to the evidence I received from her, I was sure that victory in court was quite achievable. The day I'd been looking forward to has finally arrived. On the day of the court session, I met my wife outside the courtroom, and to my surprise, her mother was also present. Jenny probably assumed that her mother would speak up for her, but without knowing Jenny, her beloved mom was actually here to support me and only me. The trial passed without any serious complications. The expression on my wife's face when she realized that her own mother was testifying against her will forever remain in my memory. Her mother fearlessly revealed all of Jenny's secrets. It turned out that she was committing adultery long before I found out about it. It is shocking that she knew about the presence of herpes in one of her partners but decided to have sexual intercourse without taking proper precautions. In the future, she entered into intimate relationships with several men, potentially exposing them to the risk of infection. By her actions, she put my health at risk, demonstrating complete disregard for the consequences. The responsibility for this guilt fell entirely on her shoulders. Trying to justify herself, she falsely claimed that I had an intimate relationship with her mother, but both her mother and I rejected these accusations with laughter and denial. Jenny had reached the point where she could no longer save her reputation. She had suffered a grand defeat. We were both well aware of this fact, but I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions even more. I was determined to declare that she would never be able to manipulate me or undermine my authority again. In order to prove unequivocally that Jenny bears full responsibility for the situation, I instructed my lawyer to submit one document to the judge. This document was an official medical certificate of urinary tract infection. It was irrefutable proof that she had an infection, leaving no room for doubt. The blame was officially placed on my now ex-wife. As a result of this situation, I received a significant amount of money as compensation, as well as the right of sole ownership of the house. Now it belonged only to me, but after that, everything went awry. I was looking for communication with Dr. Smith, or perhaps I should have called her Eliza Smith. Our bond deepened as we shared our past experiences, which eventually brought us closer together. Soon, a romantic relationship began between us. It didn't take long, and we realized that we were destined to be together. A few months later, I proposed to Eliza, and she, without a moment's hesitation, gladly agreed. Our wedding took place in Italy, in Europe, and we went on a delightful honeymoon to Cannes, France. The intimate moments we shared were truly exceptional and delighted me with Eliza's natural skill and talent. Perhaps her experience as a gynecologist played a role in our newfound pleasure. With Eliza, I could explore both traditional and alternative forms of intimate life. In addition, she gave priority to regular visits to the doctor to ensure her well-being and prevent possible venereal diseases. She encouraged me to do the same thing periodically in an effort to prevent a repeat of past experiences. We often found humor in the situation I got into with my ex-wife, as she eventually brought Eliza and me together. As a result of the showdown caused by my ex-wife, we ended up in this very place. Now we live together in the same house with a spacious garden, which we recently acquired. An unexpected twist was that a fluffy pet puppy appeared in our family. Moreover, the idea of having children, which I once despised, now began to be considered as one of the options for our future. It's amazing how life can develop in such a way that a few years ago, it was impossible to imagine. In the past, I dreamed of the opportunity to experience traditional intimacy again, considering it an unattainable desire because of my marriage to Jenny. But now, I am in a situation where I have the honor to enjoy it every day, thanks to the presence of an extraordinary woman in my life. This woman has exceeded all my expectations, and I am sure that she is the most wonderful person I have ever encountered or will ever encounter. Everything began to work out as well as possible, and I have never felt happier and more fulfilled. There are no boundaries and restrictions that would prevent me from experiencing pure bliss. Gone are the days when I endured peculiar beliefs for the sake of my marriage. Now it's just about us, about Eliza, my ex-wife's former gynecologist, and about me. Despite the unusual circumstances the two of us are facing, the vastness of the universe, and perhaps over time, there will be even more of us. It is unknown what the future holds for us, but one thing remains clear: I am happy with where I am at the moment, and I sincerely hope that Eliza feels the same. It's amazing to realize that I never expected to have such feelings for any other woman. At the moment, I can say with confidence that I want Eliza to become the mother of my future children. But in the process of healing, I realized how important it is to forgive. By holding hatred and resentment in myself, I only cause myself suffering. It was a difficult lesson, but when I started letting go of these negative emotions, I felt that a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Letting go has become a liberating experience. I realized that my life and future relationships should not be determined solely by the actions of one person. It is important for me to admit that Eliza does not know that after the divorce, I entered into an intimate relationship with her mother. I sincerely hope that she will never find out about this, as I have no desire to experience the shocks and problems that will inevitably arise. One divorce was more than enough for me, and I am not sure of the consequences that may arise if she finds out about it. That would surely be the end of me, once and for all. My God, the story doesn't end there. I think I spoke too prematurely. It's been 3 years since I wrote this whole story, and now I have 2 children, more precisely twins, 2 charming girls for whom I would give my life if it were necessary. Amazing, isn't it? Just a few years ago, the mere thought that I could have children seemed unthinkable, and now I am the parent of these precious babies, husband, and father. It's still amazing for me to say these words, but let's get back to the point. I want to clarify that I have not received any messages from the woman who was once my wife. To tell the truth, at some point, I almost forgot about her. But a few days ago, there was an unexpected and unusual phone call. It was none other than my former mother-in-law, Jenny's mother. It turned out that she changed her phone number since it was not saved in my contacts. If I had a choice, I probably wouldn't answer her call, especially if it comes from her. But contrary to common sense, I picked up the phone and immediately regretted it. She spoke to me in a quiet, inviting tone. I won't hide it, but I immediately recognized her voice. She talked about how much she misses me, how much she wants to repeat what we had. I was speechless, unable to utter a word. I just held the phone to my ear, not moving, listening to her words. I felt paralyzed, frozen in place, eyes wide with shock as an unexpected wave of trembling swept over my entire body. Everything was blurred, as if I saw everything in a fog. When I listened to the voice of my ex-wife's mother on the phone, it seemed distant to me, as if it came from some distant place clouded by a thick fog. It took me an agonizing minute to gather my strength and finish the conversation, and I can't say I'm proud of this delay. I couldn't understand why it took me so long to break the connection. I had no desire to remain connected with this family. Why did I pay attention to her words at all? Why didn't I hang up the phone as soon as I heard her voice? I couldn't give a clear answer. I couldn't find a logical explanation for my actions. All I knew was that after that conversation, my body instinctively switched to fight or flight mode. I chose the latter option. I made a conscious decision to ignore, to push this situation away from me. I even brushed off my wife's question about the identity of the caller, saying that it was just a random seller trying to sell us forks. I understand that this may seem silly, but at that moment, I was desperately trying to bury this incident and move on. Despite all my efforts, I could not forget about what had happened, especially when after a few days, the phone rang again. It's strange, but despite the fact that I didn't save her new number, I immediately recognized it as soon as it appeared on the screen. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but then, against my better judgment, I reached out and grabbed the phone. Why did I do it? I can't explain it. Perhaps it was due to the memories of the tense minutes spent with her, a woman who gave me some of the most vivid impressions in my entire life. I hate to admit it, but it was the undeniable truth. I have been denying and deceiving myself for too long. The truth was that I could no longer resist this temptation. Stupid as it may sound, but it was an undeniable reality. Therefore, contrary to common sense, I answered the call, and the regret that came over me this time was even stronger. Our conversation was short. She said she would come to me at the end of the week. She made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that she was well aware that I had a wife and children. Besides, she said she was well aware of Eliza's absence that day. When the week was coming to an end, she insisted that this was a great opportunity for our second date. I tried to reject her advances, not to succumb to temptation, but in response, I heard only her threats to tell my wife, Eliza, about everything that happened between us. I couldn't let that happen. I was trapped in blackmail. And then she abruptly interrupted the conversation. I continued to sit, not taking my eyes off the phone, and a feeling of shock spread through my veins. The weight of the news I had just received began to penetrate my soul, causing my chest to contract and my pulse to quicken. Goosebumps of fear ran down my spine as I tried to realize the seriousness of the phone call. The world around me became clouded when I realized the seriousness of the situation. I was completely immersed in a state of shock. I fell silent, unable to comprehend the words that sounded on the phone. Time seemed to freeze, plunging me into a state of paralyzing fear. Thoughts raced in my head, trying to figure out the situation, but they collided with each other, creating chaos inside me. I was thinking about the cruel hand of fate that brought this terrible news to my doorstep, and the question sounded in my head, why? Gradually, fear penetrated into my consciousness, absorbing me. An icy grip of fear tightened around my heart. Goosebumps ran down my spine, each breath became rapid and shallow, and cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My every being screamed about escape, about how to escape from the impending darkness ready to swallow me whole. The incomprehensible turned into a frightening presence lurking in the depths of my consciousness and fueling my imagination with endless scenarios of the worst outcomes. A suffocating fear settled in the depths of my stomach. It seemed that the walls were closing in, squeezing the space around me, and the impending catastrophe was getting closer. Thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of anxiety, giving no respite. Amid the chaos, the once cozy walls now seemed unfamiliar, did not give comfort, turning into an alarming presence. I felt like a ship lost at sea, relentlessly tormented by a storm. An increasing number of questions weighed down my exhausted mind. Why did this happen? Could I have done otherwise? The incessant assault of shame and self-doubt threatened to engulf me entirely. Anger squeezed my heart, piercing my spirit with the sharp sting of 1,000 needles. The fragility of life and the inexorable truth of the world struck me with such force that they left an indelible mark. However, as the initial shock gradually receded, a wave of determination washed over me. I realized the need to muster the courage to face the upcoming obstacles. I didn't let fear hinder my progress. I stood up, defended myself, and sought to banish the shadow that had entered my life. And although everything changed after that chilling phone call, I remained adamant. I made a firm decision to face the situation face to face. Just one meeting, and I would finally be free from her power. And so, we met again, deciding to end this chapter once and for all. When my wife was planning to take our children to visit her parents, I told her that I would not be able to take part in this event due to being busy at work. When I was preparing for this day, my ex-wife's mother unexpectedly visited me. We shared a moment of pleasure, and I can't deny that this meeting was very stressful. But at this moment, I am overwhelmed with guilt. Despite the fact that I hoped that this would be the end of our relationship, she continues to blackmail me. After thinking for a long time about how to solve this problem and how to get rid of the blackmail of my ex-wife's mother, a solution to this problem came to me. I was forced to write an email to my ex-wife's father in which I described the situation, hiding the details. I informed him that his wife was trying to persuade me to intimacy with the help of blackmail. I also explained that his wife wants to lie to my current wife, the mother of my children, that we had intimate contact with her only before the divorce from his daughter. I hoped for male solidarity and begged him not to inform my current wife about it, but at the same time, I asked him to protect his restless wife from my family. With anxiety in my heart, I sent him this letter. I understood that perhaps in the near future, my dear and beloved wife would find out everything, but everything remained as it was. We spent happy days together with our children, but the anxiety did not leave me. Until one fateful day, while digging in my laptop, I saw an email notification. An anxious state gripped my whole body. It was a letter from my former father-in-law. He informed me that he had read my letter because he was being treated at the clinic, but the letter was read by my ex-wife, which caused a tragedy in their house. When he was undergoing treatment, he was told a terrible reality. As it turned out, when my ex-wife found out that her mother was blackmailing me and trying to get closer, she was seized with rage. The father said that there was still fierce enmity between his wife and daughter, and after my letter, the anger from my ex-wife intensified. At night, while my ex-mother-in-law was sleeping, her daughter smothered her with a pillow. I didn't see my reflection at the moment when I read his letter, but I think I turned pale with horror. From this letter from my former father-in-law, I understood how he would curse these two corrupt women, his wife and his daughter. His wife was strangled by her own daughter, and the daughter was detained by the police. I couldn't even imagine how he endured this disappointment and grief. I did not hesitate to go to his house to support him, although I understood that it was a shame to look into his eyes. But no matter what, we continue to communicate with him. Sometimes I even visit him with my children.